So I frequently get to have conversations with folks about what it means to be successful or what success looks like. Sometimes that's students who are looking at the college and wondering what it might look like to be successful as a college student or in their career beyond that. Sometimes it's parents. Will my child be successful if he or she comes to your college? Sometimes it's alumni, that sort of thing. And I think that we as the church have a tendency to unwittingly absorb the world's definition of what it means to be successful, sort of like the proverbial frog in the kettle. We kind of get boiled, and we tend to adopt phrases like, well, he's a Christian and he's really successful, or he's a successful pastor. And I think we're often not thinking about what exactly it means to be successful. One of my favorite passages in Scripture is Genesis chapter 5, which perhaps is an unusual favorite passage of Scripture. It's a genealogy. It's the book of the generations of Adam. In a lot of ways, it's an unremarkable passage of Scripture, although it has a really wonderful rhythm to it. People live, they have a son, they live some more, they have other sons and daughters, and then they die. And it goes on like that, verse after verse after verse. So in a lot of respects, unremarkable. I think as a young person, I probably would have said the most remarkable thing about it is that that's where you find Methuselah, the oldest human being on record, 969 years old. But certainly from a literary or a textual analysis standpoint, the most notable thing in that passage is that there's one person who defies that pattern or that rhythm, and that's Enoch. It says, I think in the verses 21 to 24, Enoch, everyone else lives and dies, or lives, has a child, lives some long, dies. Enoch walks with God and then has a child, and then walks with God some more, and then is not. He's taken up. And I think it's a really interesting passage because I think it has implications for how we as Christians think about success. I think it's a notable passage for what it says about what Enoch gets noted for in that passage, and then also what he does not get noted for, and kind of what that says to us. Enoch gets noted in that passage, or is pointed out in that passage, because he walks with God, and that's a fairly well-known and pretty rich biblical metaphor for our life before God. We all know David in Psalm 1 saying, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked," or probably reminded of Paul in Colossians 1 when he says, "Walk in a manner worthy of your calling in the Lord." So a rich metaphor. It has a lot of implications. I mean, walking is something it's slow. It's not a sprint. It's an activity that has to be taught, or we have to learn how to walk. None of us come out of the womb knowing how to walk. It is an activity that is purposeful. It's how we get from point A to point B by walking in a particular direction. We have another word for when we're not walking in a particular direction. That's wandering. But walking is the biblical metaphor. And it's a process. I mean, it's step by step, but a process that we don't undertake typically while staring down at our feet, although I have a few professors who sometimes shuffle around campus staring at their feet. But it's an activity that we undertake while with our eyes pointed on a destination. And so I think that metaphor has a lot to say about our Christian life, for sure, and that's what Enoch gets noted for. I think the flip side of the coin is perhaps even more interesting, what Enoch does not get noted for. I mean, sometimes when talking to students, I'll ask them about this passage, what was remarkable about Enoch? What made him so outstanding, so notable in the eyes of God that he was taken up? Did Enoch go to a really prestigious college or university, perhaps the University of Babylon or Nineveh College or something like that? Was he a corporate CEO or the governor of ancient Mesopotamia? Was he the ancient a quarterback for the ancient Sumerian equivalent of the Alabama Crimson Tide? Was he a megachurch pastor? Did he win thousands of souls to Yahweh? Was he a plumber? Was he Scripture doesn't tell us any of those sorts of things about Enoch and about what he did. And I think that has implications for how we think about success. I mean, there's an obvious disconnect between that understanding of success and what the world often tells us about success. I mean, the world has very different definitions of what it means to be successful. If you've got a second home at the beach and a really nice car, perhaps you're successful. If you've founded Google or Apple or Facebook, you're successful. If you've done something great for Jesus or for the church, then you're successful. That's a question that I've wrestled with for much of probably almost all of my life. I grew up, for the most part, on the south side of Charlotte in a pretty up-and-coming part of town, a lot of successful business-type folks in that part of the city. And there was certainly pressure in the private school world that I grew up in to be successful, to do something. I got into some great undergraduate institutions. I was a finalist for a Moorhead Scholarship at the University of North Carolina. I had a full tuition scholarship at Duke. I had an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. I ended up going to Covenant College in the McClellan Scholars Program there. And so I made a decision that, in the view of some at least, I wasn't choosing success, and yet I still felt this real obligation to do something great for the kingdom, to be successful for the sake of the kingdom. And as a senior in college, I applied to graduate programs, and I was not accepted into a single graduate program that I applied to. Now, there's a longer story there about how not to apply to graduate schools I could tell some other time, but that was sort of a bucket of cold water on my ambitions or my aspirations to do something great, to be successful for the sake of the kingdom of Christ. And I was fortunate to have a really good relationship with a faculty member who spoke some wisdom into my life, and then had a guest speaker come to chapel and speak on this genealogy in Genesis 5 and ask the question, what does the Bible have to say about success? And I think that a big part of what that passage is telling us is that God doesn't need for us to be successful in the world's eyes in order for him to receive glory. He asks us to walk faithfully with him, and he may choose to do great things through us, but he doesn't need for us to go and do great things in our own strength in order for him to be glorified. Now, I sometimes share that with folks, and not surprisingly, parents will say, wait, so are you saying it doesn't matter are you telling my child it doesn't matter what my child does? And I'm quick to say, no, I'm not saying that at all. It does matter what we do. We're all familiar with the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. And Jesus tells this very famous parable of the servants the master leaves the servants with talents, one with 5, one with 2, one with 1. And the servant who gets 5 talents invests those talents and earns a return. And the servant who receives 2 talents invests those talents, does something with those talents, and earns a return. And the servant who receives 1 talent and buries it in the ground. And when the master comes back, the 2 servants who take the gifts or the talents that have been given to them and have earned a return with them, have made something of those. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with little. I'll place you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And then the servant who only receives the 1 talent and doesn't do anything with it, he gets cast into outer darkness. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means. I'll leave it to the biblical scholars to interpret that. But it seems pretty clear there's a principle there that we are to take the talents or the gifts that we are given, and we are to make something of them. Luke says that to whom much is given, much is required. And Paul says in Colossians that we're to work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men. So it does matter what we do with the gifts that we've been given. But I think the message of Genesis 5 is pretty clear, that we are called to faithful service, but also we're not required to do great things on God's behalf or for the sake of the kingdom necessarily. It's a message that was really driven home to me again, going back to my senior year in college, by the graduation gift that I was given by my mother. As an undergraduate at Covenant College, I studied abroad at Oxford and took some time to go up to Edinburgh while I was at Oxford, and wanted to go see John Knox's grave. And anyone who's been to what was the graveyard outside of St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh knows that that graveyard was paved over And Knox's grave was marked simply with a blank white piece of concrete in the middle of the parking lot. And I took a picture of it. Ironically, it was under the front bumper of a red BMW. And I was sort of put off or offended that John Knox, the great Presbyterian churchman who had such a profound influence on the history not only of the church in Scotland, but of Scotland as a nation, his grave would be paved over with no marker stone. And I showed the picture to my mother, and she said, stopped me and said, I doubt that it matters much to John Knox that he doesn't have a gravestone. And so as a graduation gift, she gave me a framed copy of that photograph. And on the matting, she had written Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. I still have that photograph up on my office wall today. So I think it's really important for us as believers, and I certainly hope this is true of us in the Presbyterian Church in America, that we do not forget, that we remember that we've been bought by Christ, that we're one with Him, that we're united to Him, and He is in us and we are in Him. And that means we're free to live faithfully and also fearlessly, to bring every thought captive to Jesus Christ, to bring biblical truth to bear on every dimension of life, to seek the welfare of the cities in which we find ourselves, to go boldly and to proclaim the gospel, knowing that the world is going to pitch to us a lot of different definitions of what it means to be successful. And those definitions might be subtle. They'll come to us through television, through movies, through the internet, through casual conversations. They'll focus us on ourselves, on our ambitions, on our aspirations, to do something great in the eyes of the world so we can share some of our glory with God, or to do something great for the kingdom of Christ. And Scripture certainly calls us to put to work the talents and the gifts that we've been given, but it calls us first and foremost to be faithful, to walk humbly with God. We can't let the world define for us what it means to be successful, what it means to be successful in life or in education, in our career, in our families, in our ministries. Scripture calls us to be faithful, to die to ourselves, to walk with God, and then to put our talents and our gifts to work in faithful service to Him.